The jury summons arrived on a Tuesday in March, wedged between a credit card statement and a catalog I'd never ordered. I stared at the official seal, the stark black text commanding my presence at the downtown courthouse on April 15th. 2 weeks away, I folded it in half and tossed it on my kitchen counter, where it sat like a small storm cloud over my morning coffee routine. I'd managed to avoid jury duty for 28 years. Friends had shared their war stories, weeks trapped in windowless rooms, listening to lawyers drone about technicalities, the mind-numbing boredom of civil proceedings that stretched like taffy. Sarah from work had spent 3 weeks on a personal injury case last year and came back looking like she'd aged a decade. It's like being held hostage by the justice system, she'd said, stirring her coffee with the enthusiasm of someone describing root canal surgery. The morning of April 15th arrived gray and drizzling, the kind of spring day that couldn't decide what season it wanted to be. I stood in my bathroom mirror adjusting my tie for the third time. The jury duty handbook had suggested business casual, but I'd erred on the side of formal. A navy suit I rarely wore, brown leather shoes that pinched slightly at the heel. I looked like I was going to a job interview for a position I didn't want. The courthouse loomed ahead of me as I walked from the subway, all concrete and glass rising into the overcast sky. Security lines snaked around the lobby, a mixture of reluctant citizens clutching coffee cups and lawyers wheeling briefcases behind them like loyal pets. I checked in at the jury desk, received a plastic badge with my name printed in sans serif font, and was directed to room 312. The jury assembly room was exactly what I'd expected. Institutional carpeting the color of oatmeal, fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly overhead, rows of padded chairs that had seen better decades. About 60 people sat scattered throughout the space, most staring at their phones or paperback novels, unified in our collective resignation to the day ahead. I found an empty seat in the middle section and settled in with the mystery novel I'd brought, something about a detective in Edinburgh that I'd been meaning to finish for months. The bailiff, a woman with silver hair and the bearing of a retired drill sergeant, explained the selection process. We'd be called in groups, she said. Some of us would be dismissed. Others would be chosen for panels. It could take hours. It could take all day. I opened my book and tried to lose myself in Scottish fog and murder, but the words kept sliding off the page. The room hummed with quiet conversations, the rustle of newspapers, the occasional cough. Time moved like honey. Around 10:30, my name was called along with 29 others. We were led down a hallway lined with portraits of stern-faced judges, our footsteps echoing against marble floors, and into a courtroom that smelled of old wood and industrial disinfectant. The jury box sat to the right of the judge's bench, 2 rows of chairs upholstered in burgundy leather that had probably been elegant once upon a time. I was directed to seat 7 in the front row, between a middle-aged woman knitting what looked like a scarf and an empty chair that wouldn't remain empty for long. I was settling into my seat, trying to find a comfortable position for what promised to be a long day when he walked in. He was maybe 30, tall and lean, with dark hair that looked like he'd run his fingers through it on the way in from the rain. His suit was charcoal gray, well-fitted but not expensive, the kind of thing a teacher might wear to parent-teacher conferences or a graduate student might put on for his thesis defense. He carried himself with quiet confidence, but I noticed the way he adjusted his tie as he approached the jury box. A small, nervous gesture that made him seem more human somehow. He took the seat beside me, seat 6, and I caught the faint scent of coffee and something else. Aftershave, maybe, or soap, something clean and understated. He nodded at me as he sat down, a polite smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, and I nodded back. Long day ahead, he murmured, his voice warm and slightly rough around the edges, like he'd been talking for hours, or not at all. Seems that way, I replied, surprised by how much I wanted to keep the conversation going. But the judge was entering, black robes flowing, and we all rose to our feet. The Honorable Margaret Chen looked exactly like Central Casting would order for no-nonsense federal judge. Silver hair pulled back in a tight bun, wire-rimmed glasses, the kind of steady gaze that could probably stop a charging rhino. She welcomed us to her courtroom and began explaining the case we'd potentially be hearing, a civil suit involving a construction company and a downtown office building, something about water damage and insurance claims and contractual obligations that sounded like it could stretch for weeks. As she spoke, I found myself acutely aware of the man beside me, the way he sat perfectly straight but relaxed, his hands folded in his lap, the way he tilted his head slightly when he listened, as if he were genuinely interested in the judge's words about voir dire and burden of proof. Most of the other jurors looked like they were mentally making grocery lists, but he seemed engaged, present in a way that made me want to pay attention too. The selection process began. One by one, potential jurors were called to the front to answer questions about their backgrounds, their jobs, their ability to be impartial. A woman in the back row was dismissed because her brother worked in construction. A man in his 60s was excused because he'd recently been involved in a similar lawsuit. The ranks thinned slowly. When they called my name, I walked to the front on unsteady legs, suddenly conscious of 29 pairs of eyes watching me. The lawyers asked standard questions. My job, marketing coordinator at a tech startup, my education, State University business degree, whether I knew anyone involved in the construction industry. I didn't. I answered honestly and returned to my seat, relieved to be out of the spotlight. Then they called him. Juror number 6, please state your name for the record. Michael Brennan, he said, and hearing his name felt like learning a secret. His voice carried clearly through the courtroom without being loud. Mr. Brennan, what is your occupation? I'm a librarian at the Central Branch downtown. There was something in the way he said it, not defensive but matter of fact, like he expected people to be surprised and was quietly prepared to stand by his choice. How long have you worked there? 4 years. I have a master's degree in library science from the University of Washington. I watched him from my seat, noticed the way he kept his answers concise but not curt, professional but warm. The lawyers probed a bit. Had he ever been involved in litigation? Did he have strong feelings about insurance companies? Could he evaluate evidence objectively? He answered each question thoughtfully, and I found myself hoping they wouldn't dismiss him, though I couldn't quite explain why. They didn't. By noon, 12 jurors and 2 alternates had been selected. Michael Brennan and I were both staying. Judge Chen called a lunch recess, and we filed out of the courtroom into the hallway like school children released for the day. Most of the jurors scattered immediately, some heading to the cafeteria in the basement, others pushing through the revolving doors toward the food trucks that lined the street outside. I stood uncertain for a moment, clutching my paperback and wondering whether I had time to find somewhere decent to eat. First time, Michael appeared beside me, pulling on a light jacket that brought out the green in his eyes. "Is it that obvious?" He smiled, and this time it did reach his eyes. "You have that deer in headlights look." I had it too my first time, which was about 3 years ago, different case, different courthouse. Apparently I have one of those faces that screams, "Responsible citizen, lucky you." I fell into step beside him as we walked toward the elevators. "Any recommendations for lunch?" I was planning to just grab something from a vending machine. There's a decent sandwich place across the street. Nothing fancy, but the Turkey Club is solid and they're fast. We've got an hour. The sandwich place turned out to be a narrow deli squeezed between a dry cleaner and a cell phone repair shop. The kind of place that did steady business from courthouse workers and downtown office drones. Michael ordered the Turkey Club he'd recommended. I went with a roasted vegetable panini that looked better than it probably had a right to. We found a small table by the window and I unwrapped my sandwich while Michael arranged his precisely, removing the toothpicks, straightening the chips on his plate. There was something endearing about his careful attention to small details. "So," I said, "librarian, I have to admit I don't think I've met one since elementary school. Most people haven't. We're like ninjas, highly trained but largely invisible." He took a bite of his sandwich and continued talking around it. "Sorry, that's my standard response to people who assume we just sit around shushing people and checking out romance novels." "What do you actually do?" "Research, mostly. Help people find information they can't Google effectively. Run programs for kids and seniors. Manage databases that most people don't know exist. Fix computers when they break, which is constantly." He paused. "It's not glamorous, but I like it. There's something satisfying about connecting people with exactly what they need." I found myself leaning forward, genuinely interested. "How did you get into it?" "Kind of fell into it, honestly. I was getting my master's in English literature, planning to teach, but I started working part-time at the university library to pay rent. Turned out I was good at it. The research part, at least. Digging through archives, tracking down obscure sources, helping graduate students find that one article that would make their thesis work." He gestured with half his sandwich. "When I graduated, the job market for English professors was pretty much non-existent, but the library world was hiring. So I went back to school, got the MLS, and here we are." "Any regrets?" He considered this seriously. "Sometimes I miss the idea of teaching, but honestly, I think I help more people this way. Professors reach maybe 100 students a semester. I help thousands of people a year find what they're looking for." There was something quietly passionate in the way he talked about his work, a sense of purpose that I recognized but rarely encountered. In my job, I spent most of my time trying to convince people they needed products they'd lived without just fine. It paid well enough and kept me busy, but I couldn't remember the last time I described it to someone with anything approaching enthusiasm. "What about you?" he asked. "Marketing coordinator, what does that actually involve?" "Honestly, a lot of meetings about meetings. Social media campaigns for software that helps other software run better. Trade shows in convention centers that all look exactly the same." I shrugged. "It's fine. Pays the bills. Gives me health insurance so I can afford jury duty." He laughed, a genuine sound that made something warm unfurl in my chest. "Well, at least one of us is living the dream." We talked through the rest of lunch. Nothing profound, just the kind of easy conversation that makes time disappear. He told me about the elderly man who came to the library every Tuesday to use the genealogy databases, slowly mapping his family tree back to County Cork. I told him about my coworker who'd spent 6 months developing a marketing campaign around a software update that was cancelled the week before launch. When we walked back to the courthouse, I realized I didn't want the hour to end. There was something comfortable about Michael's presence, something that made the prospect of sitting through hours of testimony slightly less daunting. As we passed through security again, he held the door for me, a small gesture that felt more significant than it probably was. The afternoon session began with opening statements. The plaintiff's attorney, a woman in her 40s with steel gray hair and the bearing of someone who'd won more cases than she'd lost, stood before us and began painting a picture of corporate negligence and willful blindness, water damage to 30 floors of office space, months of delays, millions of dollars in losses. I tried to focus on her words, to follow the thread of her argument, but I found myself distracted by Michael beside me. The way he took notes in a small leather notebook, his handwriting neat and precise. The way he leaned forward slightly when the attorney displayed photographs of the damaged building, genuinely engaged with the evidence being presented. The defense attorney countered with his own narrative, acts of nature, unforeseeable circumstances, a client who'd gone above and beyond to remedy an impossible situation. He was older, silver-haired, with the kind of voice that had probably charmed juries for decades, but somehow I found it harder to concentrate on his words than I had on the plaintiff's. My attention kept drifting to the quiet presence beside me. During a brief recess while the attorneys conferred with the judge, Michael leaned slightly in my direction. "The defense attorney reminds me of my grandfather," he whispered, barely audible. Same voice, same gestures. He used to tell these elaborate stories at family dinners that went on forever, but somehow never actually had endings. I had to bite back a laugh. "Did you believe them? Every word?" Until I was about 12 and realized that the same story kept changing depending on who was listening. When the session resumed, I found myself seeing the defense attorney through Michael's eyes, the theatrical gestures, the folksy turns of phrase that seemed calculated to charm rather than inform. It was like having a translator beside me, someone who could decode the performance aspects of what we were witnessing. The day wore on. Witness testimony about construction schedules and weather patterns and the technical specifications of waterproofing systems. Charts and graphs and photographs of pipes and joints and seals. The kind of minutiae that would have put me to sleep if I'd been watching it on television, but somehow the awareness of Michael beside me, the way he occasionally shifted in his seat, the soft sound of his pen against paper, kept me present, anchored in the moment. Around 4 o'clock, as an expert witness droned on about industry standards for basement moisture barriers, Michael and I both reached for our water bottles at the same time. Our shoulders brushed, just barely, just for a second, and neither of us pulled away immediately. The contact was brief, innocent, but it sent something electric up my arm that had nothing to do with the static from the courthouse's dry air. I was supposed to be paying attention to the trial, but all I noticed was the way he leaned closer when he spoke, as if his words were meant only for me. The way his presence seemed to create a small bubble of calm in the chaos of legal proceedings and competing narratives. The way I'd started looking forward to his quiet observations during breaks, His gentle commentary that made the whole experience feel less like an obligation and more like a shared adventure. When Judge Chen finally called an end to the day's proceedings, I felt a strange mixture of relief and disappointment. Relief that we could escape the stuffy courtroom, disappointment that our time together was ending. As we filed out of the jury box, Michael fell into step beside me. "How are you holding up?" he asked as we waited for the elevator. "Better than I expected, actually. You?" "Same. Although I have to admit, I spent more time thinking about moisture barriers this afternoon than I ever planned to in my entire life." The elevator arrived, crowded with lawyers and court staff heading home. We squeezed in near the back, close enough that I could smell his aftershave again, could feel the warmth radiating from his body in the small space. When the doors opened at the ground floor, we were swept out with the crowd into the lobby. "Which way are you headed?" he asked as we pushed through the revolving doors into the early evening air. "Red Line to Davis. You?" "Same direction. I'm getting off at Porter." We walked together toward the subway entrance, our conversation stretching naturally beyond the courthouse steps. He told me about the book he was reading, something about urban planning in post-war America that he made sound far more interesting than it probably had a right to. I found myself telling him about my weekend plans, a hiking trip I'd been looking forward to, and was surprised when he mentioned that he'd done the same trail last summer. "The view from the summit is incredible," he said. "Especially this time of year when everything's starting to turn green. You hike much?" "When I can. There's something about being outside, away from screens and noise, that helps me think. Library work is great, but it's very interior. Sometimes I need mountains to remind me there's a world beyond databases and reference questions." We descended into the subway station, the familiar rush of warm air and distant train sounds rising up to meet us. The Red Line platform was moderately crowded with the evening commute, office workers scrolling through phones, college students with overstuffed backpacks, the usual mixture of people heading home or heading out. Our train arrived with a mechanical screech, and we found seats across from each other. The conversation continued over the rumble of the rails. Books we'd read, places we'd traveled, the peculiar intimacy that develops when you're learning about someone in small, careful increments. I learned that he'd grown up in Vermont, that he'd briefly considered studying architecture before switching to English, that he made excellent coffee and terrible pancakes. When the train pulled into Porter Square, he stood and grabbed the metal pole beside his seat. "Well," he said, "this was nice. Made the day much more bearable." "Yeah," I agreed, and meant it more than I probably should have. "See you tomorrow." He nodded and headed toward the doors, then stopped and turned back. "Actually," he said, and there was something different in his voice, softer, less certain. "See you tomorrow, unless you want to grab a coffee before. There's a good place near the courthouse. Opens at 7:30. The train doors opened with a mechanical hiss. People pushed past him, eager to get home, but he stood there waiting for my answer. I could see something vulnerable in his expression, a carefully controlled hope that made my chest tighten. I started, then stopped. My heart was doing something erratic against my ribs, a rhythm that had nothing to do with the caffeine I'd consumed during the day and everything to do with the way he was looking at me. The warning tone sounded, doors closing in 30 seconds. "There's a place called Grind on State Street," he continued quickly. 7:45 if you want. No pressure. The door started to slide shut. He stepped backward onto the platform, his eyes still on mine through the window. I sat there as the train pulled away, watching his figure disappear into the crowd on the platform. My reflection stared back at me from the dark window, wide-eyed, slightly stunned, looking like someone who'd just been asked a question he'd been hoping to hear without realizing it. Coffee. Tomorrow morning. Before jury duty. Yes, I thought, as Davis Square approached and I prepared to get off the train. Yes, I wanted that very much. But I hadn't said it out loud. I just sat there like an idiot while he took a chance, put himself out there, and I'd let him walk away without an answer. I climbed the stairs from the subway platform into the cool evening air, my mind already racing ahead to tomorrow morning to 7:45 at Grind on State Street, to the possibility of seeing Michael Brennan outside, the context of jury duty and legal proceedings and burgundy leather chairs. I had his answer. I just hoped I'd have the courage to show up and give it to him. Part 2. I didn't sleep well that night. I lay in bed replaying the moment over and over. Michael standing in the train doorway, asking about coffee, the vulnerability in his voice when he said, "No pressure." The way I'd sat there like a deer in headlights while the doors closed between us. By 3 in the morning, I'd convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing. By 5, I was certain he'd been just being polite. By 6:30, I was standing in my shower trying to decide whether showing up at Grind would make me look eager or pathetic. I chose eager, or maybe I chose pathetic. Either way, at 7:40, I was pushing through the glass doors of a coffee shop I'd never been to, scanning the small space for a familiar face. He was already there, sitting at a table by the window with 2 cups in front of him. When he saw me, his face broke into a smile that made something in my chest loosen and tighten at the same time. "You came," he said, standing as I approached. "You bought me coffee," I replied, gesturing to the extra cup. I took a chance, medium roast, splash of cream. If I guessed wrong, I figured I'd have extra caffeine for jury duty. I sat down and took a sip. It was perfect, exactly how I would have ordered it myself. "Good guess." "I pay attention," he said simply, and there was something in the way he said it that made me believe he meant more than just coffee preferences. The morning light, streaming through the window, caught the green flecks in his eyes, and I realized I'd been cataloging small details about him without meaning to. The way he wrapped both hands around his coffee cup when he drank, the small scar on his knuckle that looked like it had a story, the way he seemed completely present in the moment, like there was nowhere else he'd rather be than sitting in a cramped coffee shop at 7:45 in the morning with someone he'd met less than 24 hours ago. "So," I said, "is this what you do every morning? Find coffee shops near whatever courthouse you're serving at?" "Only when there's someone worth having coffee with." The words were casual, but there was weight behind them. "This is my first repeat jury duty social engagement. I'm honored to be your first." We talked easily as the minutes passed, about nothing important, about everything that mattered. He told me about the book club he'd accidentally started at the library when he'd mentioned to one patron that he was reading the same mystery novel. I told him about my sister's wedding next month, how I was dreading being seated at the singles table with my teenage cousins. When it was time to walk to the courthouse, we fell into step naturally, and I realized something had shifted overnight. The careful politeness of strangers had evolved into something more comfortable, more intimate, like we'd crossed some invisible threshold simply by choosing to meet for coffee. Thanks for this, I said as we approached the courthouse steps. For the coffee, I mean, for asking. Thanks for showing up, he replied. I wasn't entirely sure you would. Really? You looked pretty stunned when I asked. I thought maybe I'd misread things. I stopped walking, and he stopped too, turning to face me on the sidewalk as courthouse workers streamed around us. You didn't misread anything, I said, and watched something like relief cross his face. The second day of trial began with more witness testimony, but everything felt different now. The morning coffee had established something between us, not quite a routine yet, but the possibility of one. As we settled into our seats in the jury box, Michael brushed my arm lightly with his elbow. Ready for more moisture barrier expertise? He whispered. I was born ready, I whispered back, and his quiet laugh made me feel like I'd won something. The plaintiff's attorney called an engineering consultant to the stand, a nervous man in his 50s who kept adjusting his glasses as he explained the technical specifications of waterproofing systems. I tried to focus on his testimony about sealants and membrane failures, but I was acutely aware of Michael beside me, the way he leaned forward when the witness displayed diagrams, the soft scratch of his pen against paper as he took notes. During a brief recess, as the attorneys huddled at the judge's bench discussing some procedural matter, Michael turned to me. Question, he said quietly. Are you actually following any of this, or are you just nodding at random intervals like the rest of us? I understood about half of what he said about waterproof membranes, I admitted. The other half sounded like he was speaking in code. I think that's the point. Confuse the jury with enough technical details that we just accept whatever conclusion sounds most authoritative. Cynical. Practical. I've helped enough researchers navigate academic databases to know that expertise can be performed as much as demonstrated. There was something attractive about his analytical mind, the way he could step back from the proceedings and see the larger patterns at work. In my job, I was usually too close to the details to have that kind of perspective. When the session resumed, I found myself watching the witnesses through Michael's lens, noticing the performative aspects of their testimony, the way the engineering consultant kept making eye contact with the jury during his most technical explanations, as if willing us to trust him through sheer earnestness. The way the construction foreman who testified next kept his answers short and defensive, like he was being cross-examined even during friendly questioning. Around 11:30, during a particularly dense stretch of testimony about industry standards and regulatory compliance, Michael's knee brushed against mine under the table. It was subtle, barely perceptible, the kind of contact that could have been completely accidental in the cramped confines of the jury box. But it lingered for a moment longer than an accident would explain, and when I glanced at him, I caught him looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Neither of us pulled away. The trial was supposed to be the serious part of my days, but all I remembered later were his glances, the curve of his smile, the sound of his voice when he whispered only to me, the way his presence had become the fixed point around which everything else revolved, making even the most tedious testimony bearable, because he was there to share it with. By Thursday, our morning coffee routine had solidified into something that felt natural, necessary. I found myself waking up 10 minutes earlier each day, taking extra care with my appearance in a way I couldn't quite justify to myself. Michael was always there first, always with my coffee already waiting, and the smile that greeted me each morning made the early hour worth it. Question, he said as I sat down that morning. What did you want to be when you grew up, before you knew that marketing coordinator was a thing that existed? I laughed, stirring cream into my already perfect coffee. Astronaut, then marine biologist, then briefly in middle school a professional baseball player despite the fact that I couldn't hit a curveball to save my life. What changed your mind about marine biology? I mean, I assume you figured out the baseball thing on your own? College happened. Organic chemistry happened. I realized I liked the idea of marine biology more than the actual science part. I took a sip of coffee. What about you? Always wanted to be a librarian? God, no, I wanted to be a writer. The next great American novelist, literary prizes, book tours, the whole fantasy. I spent most of college writing very serious short stories about very serious young men having very serious realizations about life. What happened to that dream? I read other people's writing and realized how much better they were than me. Turns out wanting to be a writer and being good at writing are two different things entirely. He paused. But I still love books, still love helping people find the right information at the right moment. It's not the same as creating something new, but there's value in connecting people with what they need. There was something wistful in his voice, and I had the sudden urge to tell him that maybe he'd just been comparing himself to the wrong standard, that maybe his writing was better than he thought. But we barely knew each other, and that kind of reassurance would have sounded hollow coming from someone who'd never read a word he'd written. Instead, I said, I think what you do now sounds more important than most novels I've read. He looked at me with surprise, as if he hadn't expected that response. Thank you, he said quietly. That means more than you probably realize. When we walked to the courthouse that morning, our hands brushed as we climbed the steps, and this time I was certain it wasn't accidental. Thursday afternoon brought the first real drama of the trial. The defense called the construction company's project manager to testify, a woman in her 40s with steel gray hair and the bearing of someone who'd spent decades managing complicated projects and difficult people. She was supposed to be their star witness, the one who could explain away the water damage as an act of nature that no reasonable person could have prevented. Instead, under cross-examination from the plaintiff's attorney, she began to crack. Isn't it true, Miss Rodriguez, that your company received weather reports predicting heavy rainfall in the weeks leading up to the incident? We receive weather reports constantly. That's standard practice. And isn't it true that those reports specifically warned of flooding potential in low-lying areas of the city? A pause. I don't recall the specific language of those reports. Let me refresh your memory. The attorney approached the witness stand with a stack of papers. These are the National Weather Service bulletins sent to your company's email address in the 2 weeks prior to the incident. Would you like me to read them aloud? I watched Miss Rodriguez's face change as she scanned the documents, saw her realize that her carefully prepared testimony was about to unravel. Beside me, Michael leaned forward, suddenly more engaged than he'd been all week. Shit, he whispered, so quietly that only I could hear. She's about to throw someone under the bus. He was right. Over the next hour, we watched Miss Rodriguez systematically blame everyone else in her company's chain of command. the site supervisor who hadn't properly communicated the weather warnings, the procurement manager who'd ordered inferior materials, the executive who'd pushed for an accelerated timeline despite safety concerns. Her testimony was devastating to her own side's case, and the defense attorney looked like he wanted to crawl under his table. During the afternoon recess, Michael and I found ourselves alone in the small break room adjacent to the jury assembly area. Most of the other jurors had gone outside for fresh air or down to the cafeteria for coffee, but we'd both lingered, drawn into a conversation about what we'd just witnessed. "I almost feel sorry for the defense attorney," Michael said, leaning against the counter. "He probably spent weeks preparing her, going over her testimony, making sure she stayed on message. Then she gets up there and destroys his entire case. Why do you think she did it? Suddenly start telling the truth, I mean. Maybe she got tired of carrying everyone else's lies. Or maybe she realized perjury charges were worse than whatever her company might do to her." He paused. "Sometimes people reach a breaking point where protecting themselves becomes more important than protecting the people who put them in that position." There was something in his voice that made me think he wasn't just talking about Miss Rodriguez anymore. Some weight of experience or observation that suggested he understood what it felt like to reach that kind of breaking point. The break room was quiet except for the hum of the vending machine and the distant sound of conversations from the hallway. We were standing maybe 3 feet apart, close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in his green eyes, could smell the faint scent of his aftershave mixed with courthouse coffee. "Can I ask you something?" he said quietly. "Sure." "Are you glad you got selected for this jury? I know it's been a long week and we're probably looking at several more days of testimony, but..." He didn't finish the question, but I understood what he was asking. "Are you glad we met? Are you glad this happened, even if it happened in the most mundane way possible?" "Yes," I said, and the word came out more certain than I'd expected. "I'm glad." He smiled. And there was something different about this one, less careful, more open. "Me too." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable, but it was charged with something I couldn't quite name. We stood there looking at each other, and I had the strangest feeling that we were on the edge of something, teetering between the safe territory of jury duty, acquaintances, and something more complicated, more risky. Then the door opened and 2 other jurors walked in, chatting about the afternoon's testimony, and the moment dissolved. Michael stepped back, putting proper distance between us, and I felt the loss of his proximity like a physical thing. But for the rest of the afternoon, as we sat through more testimony and legal arguments, I kept replaying that moment in the break room. The way he looked at me, the weight of that simple question, the feeling that we'd almost said something important without saying anything at all. Friday brought rain, the kind of steady, soaking spring rain that makes everything look gray and waterlogged. I showed up at Grind to find Michael already there with our usual coffees, but instead of our normal table by the window, he'd chosen one further back, away from the sound of rain against glass. "Thought we might want somewhere quieter today," he said as I sat down. "It's supposed to get worse." "How much worse?" "According to the weather app, we're looking at potential flooding in low-lying areas." He paused, "which feels a little too relevant to our current circumstances." I laughed. "Think the judge will make any jokes about it?" Judge Chen doesn't strike me as the joke-making type, but I bet at least half the jury will be thinking about the irony. He was right. As we made our way through the morning's testimony, more expert witnesses, more technical diagrams about water damage and construction timelines. I caught several jurors glancing toward the tall windows of the courtroom, watching the rain streak down the glass. The plaintiff's attorney seemed particularly pleased with the weather, as if nature itself was providing supporting evidence for her case. During the lunch recess, the rain had intensified to the point where leaving the courthouse seemed inadvisable. Most of the jurors headed to the basement cafeteria, but Michael suggested we explore the building instead. "I've been in this courthouse 4 times now," he said as we walked through marble-floored corridors lined with portraits of judges past and present, "and I've never actually looked around. Seems like a waste of architectural tourism opportunities." The building was older than I'd realized, full of details that spoke to an era when public buildings were designed to inspire civic pride rather than just house bureaucracy efficiently. High ceilings, intricate molding, brass fixtures that had been polished to a soft gleam. We found ourselves in a small reading area on the 3rd floor, tucked between 2 courtrooms, with leather chairs and tall windows that looked out over the city. "This is nice," I said, settling into one of the chairs, "like a library." "Better than most libraries, actually. These chairs probably cost more than my entire furniture budget." Michael sat in the chair across from me, and for a moment we just listened to the rain against the windows. "Can I ask you something personal?" I said. "Depends how personal." "When you said you wanted to be a writer, do you still write? Even if it's not what you do for a living?" He was quiet for a long moment, and I wondered if I'd crossed some invisible line. "Sometimes," he said finally, "nothing serious, just observations, I guess, things I notice, conversations I overhear, moments that seem worth remembering." "Like what?" "Like the way people's faces change when they find exactly the book they didn't know they were looking for, or the sound the building makes late at night when most of the staff has gone home, but a few researchers are still working in the stacks." He paused. "Or the way someone looks when they're trying to decide whether to show up for coffee with a stranger." The last comment hung in the air between us, and I felt something shift in my chest. "You wrote about that?" I might have made a few notes about Tuesday night, about wondering whether someone I just met would think I was forward or just friendly, about standing on a subway platform hoping I hadn't misread the situation completely. There was something incredibly vulnerable about his admission, the idea that our brief interaction had been worth documenting, worth remembering in detail. I wanted to ask what else he'd written, what other moments between us had struck him as noteworthy, but the intimacy of the question felt too large for a courthouse reading area. Instead, I said, "For what it's worth, I think you read the situation exactly right." He smiled, and this time, when our eyes met across the small space between our chairs, neither of us looked away. The afternoon session dragged on longer than usual, running past 5 o'clock as the attorneys worked through technical exhibits and expert testimony. By the time Judge Chen finally dismissed us for the day, the rain had reached biblical proportions. Through the courthouse windows, we could see people huddled under awnings, waiting for taxis that weren't coming or making desperate sprints between buildings. "Umbrella?" Michael asked as we gathered our things. "No, you?" "Compact one in my jacket pocket. Not really big enough for 2 people, but we could try to make it work." The offer was casual, practical, but something about the idea of sharing an umbrella with him, of standing that close, of coordinating our steps, of having his arm around my shoulders or mine around his, made my pulse quicken. "That would be great," I said, trying to match his casual tone. The umbrella turned out to be even smaller than he'd advertised, barely large enough to cover one person completely. When he opened it in the courthouse lobby, we both looked at it and I started laughing. "This is going to be interesting," he said. "Define interesting." "We're both going to get soaked, but maybe slightly less soaked than if we ran for it separately." We pushed through the revolving doors into the downpour, and immediately I understood the geometric challenge we faced. To stay even partially dry, we had to stand close enough that our shoulders pressed together, our hips bumped with every step, our faces were inches apart. The umbrella provided minimal coverage, but it gave us an excuse to hold on to each other as we navigated the wet sidewalks. Michael's free arm went around my waist, steadying me as we hurried down the courthouse steps. I found my hand on his back, guiding him around a growing puddle at the corner. We were both laughing by the time we reached the subway entrance, breathless and damp despite our efforts. "Well," he said, shaking out the umbrella, "that was an adventure. I'm only slightly waterlogged. I call that a victory." We stood in the relative warmth of the subway station, suddenly aware of how close we were standing, how his arm was still around my waist, how mine was still on his back. For a moment, neither of us moved. I could feel the warmth of his body through his damp shirt, could see water droplets in his dark hair, could smell the rain on his skin mixed with his familiar aftershave. Then the Red Line train arrived with its usual mechanical screech and we broke apart, stepping back into our usual careful distance. "Same time Monday?" he asked as the doors opened. "Absolutely," I said, and meant it more than I'd ever meant anything in my life. The weekend passed slowly. I found myself thinking about Michael at odd moments, while grocery shopping, while doing laundry, while trying to concentrate on the hiking trail I'd mentioned to him earlier in the week. Saturday night, I drafted and deleted a dozen text messages asking if he wanted to meet for coffee over the weekend, but I didn't have his number and couldn't figure out a way to get it without seeming like I was overstepping. By Monday morning, I was practically vibrating with anticipation. I arrived at Grind 10 minutes early and spent the time wondering if he'd show up. If our weekend apart had given him time to reconsider whatever was developing between us, if I'd built the whole thing up in my mind beyond what it actually was. Then he walked through the door, and the smile that spread across his face when he saw me answered every question I'd been asking myself. "Good weekend?" he asked, setting down 2 cups of coffee. "Long weekend," I replied honestly. "Yours?" "Same." I kept thinking about the trial, wondering if we'd get closing arguments this week. "Just the trial?" He looked at me over his coffee cup, and there was something different in his expression, less careful, more direct. "Not just the trial," he said quietly. The second week of proceedings brought us into the final phase of the case. Both sides rested by Wednesday afternoon and closing arguments were scheduled for Thursday morning. Judge Chen explained that after closing arguments we would begin deliberations, which could take anywhere from a few hours to several days, depending on how quickly we reach consensus. The prospect of the trial ending felt strange, almost melancholy. For nearly 2 weeks, jury duty had provided a structure to my days. that had nothing to do with work or normal life and everything to do with spending time with Michael. Morning coffee, whispered conversations during testimony, shared lunches, the comfortable routine of sitting beside each other for hours at a time. The idea that it might all be over soon left me feeling oddly bereft. "How do you think we'll vote?" Michael asked during Thursday's lunch break. Closing arguments had been delivered that morning, the plaintiff's attorney passionate and precise, the defense attorney doing his best to salvage a case that his own witness had damaged beyond repair. "I think it's pretty clear the construction company screwed up," I said. "The question is how much they owe." "Agreed, though I suspect we'll have at least one holdout who wants to debate every detail." He was right. When we were finally escorted to the jury deliberation room that afternoon, a windowless space with a long table, uncomfortable chairs, and institutional carpeting that had seen better decades, it quickly became clear that reaching consensus was going to take time. The foreman, a retired accountant named Harold, who took his responsibilities very seriously, wanted to review every piece of evidence systematically. Juror number 3, a woman in her 60s who seemed skeptical of both sides throughout the trial, kept raising questions about the plaintiff's damage calculations. Juror number 8 insisted we needed to discuss the broader implications of our decision for the construction industry as a whole. Michael and I sat across from each other at the long table, occasionally catching each other's eyes during particularly tedious exchanges. Around 4 o'clock, Harold suggested we take a break, and most of the jurors filed out to use the restroom or get coffee from the machine down the hall. Michael and I were the last to leave, both moving slowly, neither particularly eager to rejoin the endless circular discussion about liability percentages and industry standards. "This could take days," he said as we lingered in the empty deliberation room. "Harold seems like the type who wants to discuss every footnote in every expert report. At least it gives us more time." Something in the way he said it made me look at him more carefully. "More time for what?" "More time before this ends," he said quietly. "Before we go back to our regular lives and stop having reasons to see each other every day." The admission hung between us, vulnerable and honest. We were standing maybe 4 feet apart, alone, in a room that suddenly felt much smaller than it had with 12 people crowded around the table. "I've been thinking the same thing," I said. "Really, I don't want this to be over when the trial ends." The words came out before I could second guess them, and immediately I felt exposed, like I'd revealed more than I'd intended. But Michael's face softened and he took a step closer. "Neither do I," he said. "We might have said more, might have finally acknowledged what had been building between us for 2 weeks, but footsteps in the hallway announced the return of our fellow jurors." Michael stepped back, putting proper distance between us, and I busied myself organizing my notes as Harold led the group back into the room. But for the rest of the afternoon, as we debated damage calculations and liability percentages, I kept replaying those few minutes alone with Michael, the way he'd admitted he didn't want our time together to end, the way he'd looked at me when I said the same thing, the feeling that we were circling something important, getting closer to saying what we both seemed to be thinking. Thursday's deliberations ended without a verdict. Friday brought more of the same: careful review of evidence, detailed discussion of legal instructions, Harold's methodical approach to every aspect of the case. We were making progress, but slowly, and Judge Chen had warned us that if we didn't reach a decision by end of day Friday, We'd have to return Monday morning. By 5 o'clock Friday, we were close, but not quite there. The major questions had been settled. Yes, the construction company was liable. Yes, the plaintiff deserved significant damages. But we were still haggling over the exact amount, and 2 jurors remained holdouts on the final number. "We'll resume Monday morning at 9, Judge Chen announced when Harold reported that we needed more time. "Please remember not to discuss the case with anyone over the weekend, including your fellow jurors. Don't read any news coverage of the trial. Don't do any independent research. I'll see you all Monday morning." As we filed out of the courthouse into the late afternoon sunshine, I felt a familiar mixture of anticipation and melancholy. One more weekend, then probably one more day of deliberations, and then it would all be over. Michael and I would return to our separate lives, and this strange, intimate interlude would become just a memory. Michael fell into step beside me as we walked toward the subway, but instead of our usual easy conversation, we were both quiet, lost in our own thoughts. "Coffee Monday morning?" I asked as we approached the Red Line entrance. "Of course," he said, but there was something subdued about his response. We stood at the top of the subway stairs, commuters flowing around us, and for a moment neither of us moved to leave. "This is strange," Michael said finally. "What is?" "Knowing it's almost over. The trial, I mean. All of this." He gestured vaguely between us. "It doesn't have to be over," I said, the words coming out more urgent than I'd intended. "I mean, just because the trial ends doesn't mean we can't still see each other." He looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Is that what you want?" "Yes," I said without hesitation. "Very much." Something shifted in his face, relief mixed with something deeper. "Good," he said quietly, "because I was hoping you'd say that." A train rumbled into the station below us, and reluctantly we both started down the stairs. But as we reached the platform level, Michael caught my arm gently. "Tomorrow might be the last day," he said, and there was something vulnerable in his voice. "But maybe it doesn't have to be the last time we see each other." The train doors opened, and people pushed past us toward the cars. I stood there looking at Michael, at this man who had somehow become the most important part of my days, who had turned jury duty from an obligation into something I looked forward to, who had made me realize that sometimes the most significant things happen in the most ordinary places. "No," I said as the warning tone sounded and the doors prepared to close. "It doesn't have to be." He smiled then, and it was the kind of smile that made me understand why people wrote love songs and poetry and stayed up all night talking about the future. The kind of smile that made everything else, the crowded subway platform, the noise of the train, the knowledge that Monday might bring the end of our shared routine, fade into background noise. "Good," he said as we stepped into the subway car together, "because I have some ideas about what comes next." The doors closed and the train pulled away from the station, carrying us toward whatever came after jury duty, after the verdict, after this strange and wonderful beginning that had started with a reluctant summons and had somehow become the most important 2 weeks of my year. To be continued.